Hello, and thank you for joining us for a Duckhorn Portfolio webinar. I'm Kay Molaski. I'm the Senior Manager of Trade Relations and Education, and it is my pleasure today to meet with Mike Waller.
Thank
Hi,
you, Kay.
Mike.
Hi.
Hi. Mike Waller is the delightful and talented winemaker behind the Calera wines, and we're fortunate to have his time today. What we're talking about today are two sides of how the Calera winery makes wine. We have two wines on the table under the Central Coast tier, and we have two wines today under the Mount Harlan tier. In the case of the Central Coast wines, we are in the 2023 vintage, and in the case of the Mount Harlan wines, we're in the 2022 vintage. So, Mike, before we get into the wines, just for the audience out there, just a reminder, Calera is California legend. This is a winery begun in 1975 by a deeply important wine figure named Josh Jensen. If you don't know Calera terribly well, I encourage you to get comfortable with it, learn up, read up. The Calera story is extraordinary. And Calera became a part of the Duckhorn portfolio in 2017. In fact, it marks our very first acquisition. When you think about our company's goal to set a standard for American fine wine, Calera fits so marvelously into that because the work that's been done in the creation of world-class Pinot Noir from this winery over the last 40 years is something you could spend a lot of time on. So we're talking about those two tiers, the Central Coast tier and the Mount Harlan tier. First up today, Mike, I think before we talk about the individual wine, maybe a thought or two for our audience about what the 2023 season was like for you down in the Hollister area.
Well, coming off of 4 years of really low rainfall in a
Mhm.
drought, it was massive rainfall for us that year. I mean, we got over 40 inches, which is
Wow.
record setting from our time owning Mount Harlan. Throughout the Central Coast, very similar. Much looked forward to much needed rainfall in 2023. The growing season went spectacular after that, and we're back on track.
That's great.
Yep.
That's great. And when it comes to the Central Coast here, these two wines, as I tell you all the time, it's an embarrassment of riches, right? The Duckhorn portfolio has so many options in it. These two wines, the Central Coast Chardonnay and Central Coast Pinot, are personal favorites of mine, and I think they offer such style and such deliciousness, and also a very, very friendly price point. A number of you have had a great successes placing these wines for those reasons. Mike, how about I like to hear you walk them through? Let's pretend they haven't heard it before. What's your sort of production pathway on making this delicious Chardonnay?
Well, I mean, it really all starts out in the
Mhm.
vineyards, right?
Of
I mean,
course.
and this is the way we talk about these things, but it's relationships with
Mhm.
vineyard growers. It's looking for the right areas, and Central Coast is a very vast region,
That's right.
and you're trying to find little pockets where that Chardonnay and Pinot are grown. I mean, Central Coast, there's also Cabernet.
Yeah,
Everything else,
that's
but
true.
there's pockets in all these places. So we've worked for the last 40 years up and down the Central Coast area, finding vineyards that we can work with in these pockets that we really like. So it's when you're making these wines, you might be buying some fruit from Santa Barbara, from San Luis Obispo,
Hmm.
Monterey County, and they all have to fit together, right?
Hmm.
And we can bring new vineyards on because there's always new vineyards and there's always new relationships to be had. So I think the number one thing though for this is those relationships you have with the growers. When they get to know what you're looking for, what to expect from you. I'm not always the easiest winemaker to deal with because I might ask for a little bit more, especially at this price point. It's tough for some growers to do the things that you're looking for them to do. But with those relationships over the years and having, their vineyard be a part of Calera, it means something to all of us.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I absolutely get that. Well, and we talked about this earlier with Joseph Zarni. You know, we want to be the type of company that people like to work with,
Yeah.
and being exacting about your needs just fits with what we're trying to get to. Wine all begins in the vineyard. So these are, and you've often, Mike, you and I've done these together many times. You sometimes almost put yourself in the back seat. You talk about taking a low intervention approach to this.
Yeah, I mean, we're just winemakers, right? I mean,
Right.
we're just like the stewards of showing off a piece of earth. And I think the less intervention you have, the more interesting the wines become, and the more they get to showcase their places on earth.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. So, also, quick comment. I don't know if you guys can see this terribly well, but whenever you do start to see these 23 vintage wines from the Central Coast here, just pointing out that we did a little label refresh. So the Calera, for which Calera Winery is named, is actually rendered in more of a three-dimensional look here. So I think that looks nice. It's very elegant, and it's going to look great on a shelf or a back bar. So little label refresh for the 23 vintage. What isn't new are some of the sourcing behind this wine, Mike. So you just mentioned those areas again, but for the folks at home, remind them when we say Central Coast, where are those sweet spots that you're looking for Chardonnay?
Yeah, I mean, I've seemed to be gravitating more towards the San Luis Obispo County. I really like, the Edna Valley. I think has really fantastic fruit, and I feel like, there's good structure, good acid there. But with that, I mean, I'm still sourcing fruit from Monterey County,
Sure.
a little bit from our own county, San Benito County. And you're just looking for these wines to all work well with each other, and they all have their own unique qualities. But then in the end, you're making a complete blend.
Yeah, well, I love it when you talk about it's about a puzzle, and especially for something like this, because each of those vineyards has to be delicious on its own. But if they don't complement one another, we're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Great. 100% Chardonnay.
Yes.
All whole cluster pressed.
All cluster pressed. 100% barrel fermented.
That's right.
And usually about 5% new oak, so it's really not going to be oak prevalent, but there is 100% French oak, 5% new, typically aged for about 9 to 10 months, and bottled. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And do you those 9 to 10 months is certainly aging a very big part of this?
Yes, it is. I mean, I typically what we're doing is we're actually stirring the lees on these, and not overly abundant. Not maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 weeks, just depending on where they are in their cycle. But they typically go through 100% malolactic fermentation. I do like to stir during that time, and it just seems to aid in getting that malolactic to finish. So, but at the same time, it's giving you a little bit more mouthfeel. I think these are definitely acid-driven wines.
Very much so.
So you need a little bit of that mouthfeel. So you just get a little more seriousness.
Well, and you managed to make this Chardonnay tasted great to me when I opened it a second ago. It's perky and lifted, but it also has a smoothness to it. So you're managing to hit some space between. It's not angular.
Yeah.
But it's sort of lean.
Yeah. Well, and that's the whole point behind it, right? I find when wines are one dimensional, they tend to be very boring. I want to see wines that have, that tension. When there's tension in a wine, it creates thought, right? And I think it also creates something that's pleasing to the palate.
Well, and such a beauty to eat with. I think our company excels at that. It's why we have such great presence in restaurants. This just makes me want it makes me want, frankly, it just makes me want seafood. I want shellfish or even something like rockfish or halibut. And it's also, this wine is always really citrusy. So the lemony quality to it is just very, very.
So where's the seafood?
I'm just giving ideas. I'm just tormenting us with
yes.
ideas.
Okay.
And I think the Central Coast Chard, to me, Mike, you can tell me if you smell this as well. I always get kind of a green apple quality to it that I find really attractive.
Yeah, and I think that quality comes from like that Edna Valley kind of a typical piece, which is much different than our Mount Harlan Chardonnay, which I think is more austere, but this one really shows off more of its fruit presence, maybe a little bit of that tropical flavor, but yeah, that's
well, and I like that too, because those of you that know this brand well would know that we make Chardonnay at this level, and then there's also that coveted Mount Harlan Chardonnay, and I think you can see a house style between the two of them.
Yes,
but they're certainly not interchangeable for one another.
Yeah. And we make all these wines really with the same sense in mind. I mean, they're all native yeast fermented, right? We're using the same barrels that we used for Mount Marlin Chardonnay the year before. They, they're the only difference really is aging time and the percentage of new oak.
Mhm. I think this wine also is a surprise, and you've said it to me before on camera, and it surprised me that 100% malolactic fermentation, but yet
Yeah,
you don't necessarily get that diacetyl tone or
yeah,
I'm not getting that at all.
yeah. No, and you won't because you know, first of all, if you get through malolactic fermentation
Hmm.
and you allow it to go all the way through, you're usually getting out of the citric acid cycle
Yep.
where the
Yep.
diacetyl can come in. So the citric is also eaten. So you're not getting that butterscotch, buttery
Not
popcorn
at all.
type of thing from
Not at all.
this because it doesn't go have diacetyl in it. But it still has plenty of acid that
Mhm.
balances out that lactic,
Mhm.
the lactic acids.
I get, and I said this to you earlier, it's very flinty.
Yeah.
The rocky quality to it really comes through. The Central Coast Chardonnay, if you guys have missed it, because the company makes Chardonnay at so many businesses, Mike, as we have them for Napa Valley from Duckhorn, and we have Sonoma Coast from Migration. I mean, we Sonoma Cutrer is now a part of our
Yep.
company, but this guy here does have a thumbprint to it like nothing else in the portfolio.
Yeah. We're looking at different regions, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, this is a very place-driven company. I mean, we always talk about that. These wines have to be reflective of the places that they came from, and that shows the Central Coast in a very sophisticated way.
Yeah.
Delicious, delicious. Now, and did you say that I forget this sometimes? You like that native yeast fermentation on a Mount Harlan tier, but you also apply that
Oh yeah.
on the Central Coast tier.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people think it's very risky because
Mhm.
the case production that we're working with, but we've become so accustomed to it, and
Yeah.
we know that yeast runs rampant through
Yeah.
the winery, right? Not necessarily on the grapes that come in, but in the winery. And we've never had a problem with finishing ferments.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of hope and pray.
Yeah.
Let's let it go.
Yeah, what I think he said to me one time, we're using the unique flora of Calera.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that. I like that. Okay, well there and as I told you earlier, you guys probably can't see this on camera, but just gorgeous. I mean, it's just almost glowing. That color, it's very brilliant.
Yeah.
Eye catching.
Thank you.
Eye catching. Okay, so let's talk about this wine's sort of bookend. I think that's very appropriate.
Yep.
Again, with that label refresh, Calera, of course, translates roughly from Spanish to mean lime kiln, and there is literally a primitive lime kiln on the hilltop that indicates the fact that limestone had been quarried on this hilltop prior to Josh Jensen buying it and starting his life's work. So I know that's kind of a wordy explanation, but that is what is depicted here. So I think understanding a business often begins with why is it called what it's called.
Yeah.
So
Well, you have to look at behind the story behind it. Josh was looking for limestone, right?
correct.
And why is there a lime kiln on the property? Because there's limestone on the
Yeah.
property that they used to use to,
Yeah.
burn down to make lime. So
Mhm.
yes.
So he saw that that was he was getting closer, right, on that quest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So with Central Coast Pinot Noir, a thought quickly before this is the first Pinot to talk about today. This is 100% Pinot Noir, as you would expect. And I just want to make this point, and Mike knows what I'm about to say, just like all the Pinot Noir in the entire portfolio. It's worth saying only because some of our peers in this space are perhaps a little bit more experimental or less traditional in how they approach making Pinot Noir. So I know I get a lot of pride out of being associated with a company that takes Pinot Noir this seriously.
Well, we've always called ourselves Pinot purists, right?
Correct.
If you're
Good,
going to make
good.
Pinot Noir, it's going to be Pinot Noir and
Yeah.
not anything else. Because
Well said.
you can manipulate something,
can.
and we're not here to manipulate. We're here to showcase a piece of earth.
I love it. Wonderful. Yeah. And when you have sourcing of this caliber and a winemaker of your skill, we don't have to futz around with additives and do something weird. We
Yeah.
just need to make really high quality Pinot Noir. So let's talk about this. Now, I know sometimes when we talk about Central Coast Chardonnay and Central Coast Pinot Noir, you talk about that same approach, that swath of areas that you just mentioned. Any other areas that we're not thinking about, Mike, that contribute here?
No, I mean, really, it's a lot of the same areas. Percentage like I think earlier I was saying the Chardonnay's tending to gravitate more towards that San Luis Obispo as being the brunt. This one I think is a little more spread out because we've worked with these vineyards for a long time. Pinot Noir, I mean Chardonnay and Pinot Noir have been planted together everywhere, right?
Mhm.
But I find that there's some really interesting areas in San Benito County where we live,
Mhm.
right down the road from the winery. There's some great vineyards, and obviously in Monterey County, Santa Barbara County, is well known
I love
for its
Santa
Pinot
Barbara.
Noir. But the goal is, I'm not sitting here trying to make a Pinot Noir that everybody else is making.
Yep.
I'm not showcasing one specific region for this wine because we have our Mount Harlan wines to do that.
Yes.
I'm trying to make a Pinot Noir of very interesting, uh, you know, vineyard varieties, or sorry, different vineyards from around the Central Coast that work together that kind of like resemble what Calera is. It's our
Mhm.
gateway drug
I
to
love that.
getting into the Mount Harlan wines.
This should show. I love that. This should give you. So that's. I've never thought about it like that. Pardon me, the Central Coast tier should be the front door to Calera in totality.
Yeah, yeah, that's the way we're looking
Yeah.
at it. And we make the wines again very similar to Mount Harlan. There's more exception with the Pinot because we do mostly destemming on it, but this is a wine that's going to be approachable right away.
Mhm.
Like my Mount Harlan wines will not be approachable for the first couple of years
Yep.
because they age for 18 months and they get in the bottle for another 18 months a lot of times before they're released. The Central Coast are going to be released after a year and a half, so we want them to be very approachable, but still very food friendly.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
kind of live along the lines of what Mount Harlan is. Again, they use the old Mount Harlan barrels that we've used. We're using maybe 10% new oak on this, and they're only aging for 10 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then and for those that are watching with us today that haven't had a chance to go to Calera, talk to them a minute, Mike, about I think it's fascinating the way the physical winery literally kind of goes in layers down that hillside because it's kind of cool how you crush up here and it moves through the winery via gravity.
Yeah. Well, at the time, Josh Josh happened. This worked out perfectly because I think he always thought of having a gravity flow winery. Well, that parcel that we're on, our winery was an old rock crushing plant that
Yep.
naturally used gravity, right? So we've built it up so it's actually 7 tiers of gravity feed. And at the time, we really were like anti-pump because back in the 70s and 80s, the pumps just were a little more brutal on these wines that we
Yes.
thought were more delicate. Um, you know, so we really are not pumping. We're using gravity to get our wines into the kind of final stages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you guys know that I like to say, Mike, I don't know if you've ever heard me make this point, but for those of us that are on the hospitality and education side, we take the hosting of our visitors as seriously as you guys take the making of the wine, right?
Yeah.
So you put those two things together and you've got a pretty formidable company. So I want to say, if you have visitors that would like to see what Mike just described, let us hook you up with a visit to Calera. It's not exactly around the corner,
Yeah.
but it is a unique place in the California wine world, and you could see physically what Mike just described, or we could make sure that your guest sees the cave system that's so important to how the wines are matured.
Yeah, yeah, and I gotta say, like, since we've enhanced the tasting experience with being with Duckhorn from the early years. Before it was, I mean, not that you're gonna not have a bad experience there, but it was really basic. We're gonna take you and taste some wines, and maybe we'll walk you through the cellar. But now we actually have a really good tasting experience.
I believe
think,
that.
for people. Yeah.
No, you deserve that. I mean, these wines are world class and unique. That Central Coast Pinot to me is always again leanness, lifted acidity. It's almost crunchy and very breadfruit driven.
Yep.
So charming, and this is a by the glass pour all day.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Very approachable.
And kind of rhubarb, if that's right. If
I
that's
like
right
that. I just got that as
because it's like it's right, but it also has a savory tone to it that I associate with that. That's an odd vegetable, but that's what I'm thinking of.
It's an odd vegetable, but you think about strawberry rhubarb. Right?
Correct.
And I
That
think
is kind of what it
what's
is.
strawberry rhubarb? It's sweetness with almost a little bit of this bitter,
Mhm.
almost something that creates tension.
Mhm.
What we were talking about earlier. I think it's a wine that like definitely pairs well with food because it has that tension.
And a spicy quality to it as well. Like literally not black pepper like Zinfandel, but like white pepper, maybe like a quieter
Yep.
kind of peppery tone. Oh, that's so good. That is so good.
Thank
So
you.
so no surprise. The Central Coast here always delicious, approachable, and I think sometimes, Mike, here's a thought. I like you said this earlier about you want to make wines that aren't dull, that provoke thought.
Yeah.
I think that both of those wines challenge your notion of Pinot and Chardonnay a little bit. In a good way.
Yeah.
If the person is not really drunk wines that have this restraint and this style to them, and you're also right to say the Central Coast tier gives you an introductory handshake to what Calera can do, because I do think these wines are like nothing else in California.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, you're like no one else makes wine in California, so
Yeah, I'm pretty weird.
no, you're not. Well, I don't know what it says about me that your voice that I've always enjoyed you a lot. Okay, now we're talking about Central Coast here in all its glory. Thank you, Mike. We now have two ideas to talk about that come from the Mount Harlan tier, and of course, the Mount Harlan tier is where Calera really kind of puts its big boots on, right? This is where Calera starts to. This is where Calera has earned accolades like being considered California's Romana Conti, and these are not things that we said about ourselves. These are things that have been said of us. There's a reason why Calera has been inside. What is it? The Wine and Spirits Top 100, just unbelievable amount of times. So the Mount Harlan tier is where things get very, very unique. I'm sure you guys have heard myself and other folks make the point that Calera and its appellation are in a relationship that could be described as a monopool, which is fascinating. So the two we're looking at today are both De Villiers and Jensen. So 6 blocks on the hilltop, planted at different times. And surprisingly, even though they're all so kind of tightly knit together, you get very different flavors depending on what block you're on.
Yeah. They're very, yeah. I mean, so they butt each other, these vineyards. One, I mean, this is a good depiction of the two vineyards, because Jensen was one of our original plantings in 1975, and De Villiers is our baby. It was planted in 1997. Yeah, you know, I guess we're getting close. We're getting close to it being 30 years old, but you know, we're gonna call that a baby. So, Jensen or the De Villiers is on this, you know, western or eastern facing slope with very undulating hills. Jensen's planted in an amphitheater type deal with 4 different blocks with 4 different 4 different elevations and exposures. So, you know, they are completely different, but this is a great way to look at our wines and why we actually make single vineyards, because Pinot Noir is so dependent on its soil, even from site to site that is right next to each other.
Yeah.
So it's not something that, you know, we've in the past, you know, in the early days, Josh was always asked, why don't you just make two wines, a reserve and this? And Josh was like, well, I learned making wine from Burgundy, and I've seen this site and this site making 2 completely different wines. So it's the way we've always done it.
And when you think about the what makes Mount Harlan, it's the soils, which are, by the way, I'm sure all of you that, you know, many of you have been in the company a bit, you'll recognize that the packaging on the Mount Harlan tier includes this incredibly detailed panel about vine spacing, age of vines, elevation. And I think elevation is always interesting to me, Mike, because these are truly some of the highest elevated vineyards in the state of California.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for the most part, for a while, I think we were the highest elevated vineyards, but we were 22 to 2,500 feet. And I think, you know, just the rugged terrain that we're on, the limestone soils, the elevation creates a lot of tension for these vines, producing very intense fruit character.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And of course, if you're kind of heart-driven people as I am, I think that it's interesting to understand how Josh named these blocks all for somebody that had been influential, supportive, important to him
Yeah.
on his journey. So the De Villiers block is named for the author of the book that was written about everything that Josh was trying to do there. That's a pretty good read, actually,
Yeah.
called The Heartbreak Grape. So that author's name was Mark De Villiers, and in 1997, this block was planted and named for Mark.
Yeah. It was.
Now, what do you think about if you were presented your own wines blind, and I need you to find De Villiers? What are you looking for that helps you know that it's De Villiers?
I think De Villiers has a much simpler, but not simpler, but very fruitful quality to it, with still a little more structure and prevalent tannin, right?
Okay.
Than something like Jensen. I'm kind of always thinking that, like, the dark black cherry range, maybe even a little bit of that cherry cola quality to it. But really, you can almost, if you want to taste between these two vineyards right here, I think because the Jensen's now going to be 50 years old next year, that vineyard has the tannins on there are much more subtle. They're there and they hold the wine together, but they're much more subtle than maybe something like De Villiers.
And even with that said, and by the way, I always try to mention to you guys about a tasting order. It is important to think about if and you guys sometimes go out to the marketplace for 6 or 8 things in the bag. What order do you get them out? So we would suggest that De Villiers precede Jensen, because the Jensen palate intensity I think is a bit heavier.
Yeah, I think that you're just getting more layers.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of want to taste this after tasting De Villiers. I really think that's a subjective thing. I've learned this from Josh. This is the way we've always tasted these wines. And it went from De Villiers to Ryan, the Young Vineyards, to Mills, the next, and then it went Reed, Jensen, Selick. That's the way we've always tasted them. And so I guess I'm the new proprietor of
you are,
or the guy that actually has to keep this moving on. So I'm a traditionalist when it comes to that stuff.
Nothing wrong with that. We don't always have it. Let's not take apart things that have traditionally worked. De Villiers is very friendly and juicy and outgoing. I think Jensen is a little more cerebral, and it's a little bit, I don't want to call it introverted, but it's wrapped a little tighter. De Villiers, I think, is showier in its youth than Jensen is.
I agree. And then most of our hardcore fans are people that will lay these down for 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. So. And they can do it. I mean, that's one of the things that I think Spectator was alluding to when they called this the California equivalent of Romano Conti, is that those wines would be thought of as very cellarable wines, and so are the wines of Calera Mount Harlan. I think that's also where the Central Coast here is so important, because it does give you something that's really, really immediate.
Yeah, I would say so.
Well, that De Villiers is delicious, and I think the longer I work with these wines, the better I'm getting at recognizing them individually. There's a tone to that I sort of recognize, and there's definitely a tone to Jensen that kind of rings true. So let's talk about Jensen for a minute.
Okay.
Mike, let's move this guy to the side and let's
Okay.
push the Jensen forward. This is certainly one of the, as you call them, those first 3 plantings.
Yeah.
And remind me, when was this planted? This would have been
75. 75. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So 50 years old next year. There's not a lot of Pinot Noir vines in California that are 50 years old.
And this hasn't been replanted?
This has not been replanted. We have a small section that we've replanted, about an acre, and out of total 10 acres.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that too. I pulled this just to remind myself of sizing. That De Villiers block is 15 and a bit.
Yeah.
And Jensen is 13 and a bit.
Okay.
In the block sizes. Okay, so 13.8 acres, and part of it is original, and it's coming into its 50th year.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
A good portion of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. This one, I always make the point to say, as a true, what do I call it? I hate to say it, daddy's girl, but I was very close to my own father. The idea that he named this one for his dad always gets me.
Yeah. Well, I think that was his dad was very supportive of
Of
what
course.
he was doing. I mean, this is a man with a dream that had a
Mhm.
family that actually supported that. I
Yeah.
think that's pretty awesome.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. It is because it was outlandish. I mean, not to go too much in the weeds on this, but you and I have talked about this before. When Josh Jensen is getting this all going, intelligentsia here in California didn't believe that Pinot Noir belonged in this state.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, there was a handful of people that are actually doing it. I think
Yeah.
they can be put in the same book as Josh.
Yes.
Um, but he's 50 years of us making these wines has been pretty incredible. I mean, and I think that, we haven't changed. We haven't adjusted the way that we make wines. We're doing the same thing.
And it's and think about like selling wine. I mean, going around to California restaurants in the early '80s with Pinot Noir was a very different endeavor than today.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
that's where, by the way, and I know you and I have talked about this. This is where Dan Duckhorn's story and Josh Jensen's story feel so
Yeah,
parallel.
they really are. And I think and they became friends actually, and we were at a lot of these tastings, and Dan Duckhorn, pioneer of Merlot,
Yeah.
in California, Josh of Pinot, and two varieties that just didn't have a name for themselves at the time.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
saw themselves as fellow travelers, don't you
Yeah,
think?
yeah,
Like,
oh yeah,
kind
for
of,
sure.
kind of working that same
Yeah,
lane.
yeah.
That's that's impressive, Mike. I mean, that is attention getting. Like, I know Pinot Noir is always kind of about subtlety, but that Pinot is taking your full attention.
Yeah, and I think again, it's pretty cerebral, doesn't it?
It does. It does. It does.
Makes you think. That's and it's definitely something that's going to go well with food. And I think Pinot's so versatile. It can go
Oh,
with
it
anything.
is. It is. It is. It's funny. We sometimes talk about like a bright cherry tone. To me, this always reminds me of almost. It sounds unappealing, but I don't mean it to be. It's sour cherry. It's like underripe cherry.
Yeah, yeah. It has some of that, and it also has some of that, like, you know, Luden's cough drop type of
Yes.
thing that,
Yes.
it's not. It's just one of the descriptors. It's like, that's pretty basic, but then you put it in your mouth, and then it just carries on, doesn't it? And it just changes and evolves. Yeah.
And when folks taste this and they don't know what it reminds them of, I love being able to say, well, it tastes like Mount Harlan,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Because if you're trying to apply this to even the regions around it, you're going to come up a little bit empty.
And Mount Harlan is a super unique site, and we're the only vineyard on Mount Harlan, so it's nobody else is doing this, and that's what makes it fun.
Mm. Always a pleasure, Mike. Those are outstanding. I want to ask you, as we look at these 22 and 23 wines, where are you in 24? Just as a concluding thought, and bring you back to right now, end of the 24 calendar year. Do you have all your 24s to barrel yet?
Oh yeah, all
Yeah?
my 24s
Great.
are in barrel. In fact, right before Christmas time, they all finish malolactic, so they're put to bed.
Okay.
Which is really great. I mean, it's one of those things that I can go and enjoy Christmas now.
Good for you. Good for you. And maybe drink a bottle or two of this kind of stuff right here.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Your opportunity. Anything else we didn't touch on that you feel like is worthy of the folks that are selling your fine wines for you?
No, I just thank you guys. I mean, it's we can't do this without it. You guys, I don't know how to do it.
Actually, you'd be surprised. Well, with that, then we'll simply wrap up for the day. Thank you so much for your attention and tuning in. Enjoy representing and selling and placing these extraordinary wines. Calera is such a gem in a portfolio, and we thank you, Mike, for your stewardship down there. You do a marvelous job, and these wines are outstanding.
Thank you, Kay.
You're welcome. Thank you guys so much. Have a good afternoon.